The Game Boy Color is a nifty little console by Nintendo that has one big flaw. The screen. You can barely see it, especially with no light. The Analogue Pocket is a nifty little console with one big flaw. It's expensive, especially when currently they are out of stock and scalpers are having a field day with it. But what if there was a way to, combine these two? Get the best of the Game Boy Color and the best of the Analogue Pocket, like a FPGA Game Boy Color, a FPGBC. Oh wow, that worked. It's a FPGBC by Funny Playing, a nifty little console that takes the greatness of the Game Boy Color and adds some of the pizzazz from the Analogue Pocket. The FPGBC is a kit sold by Funny Playing, which contains the motherboard, a speaker, the screen, and the battery. You need to additionally purchase the shell, the buttons, and the membranes. All of this together runs you at about the same price as a used Game Boy Color with a screen mod and a battery mod. It might even be cheaper. And of course, it's much cheaper than the Analogue Pocket. Now first, there are only two downsides of this console. The first is, opposed to the Analogue Pocket, you can only play Game Boy and Game Boy Color on this device. However, I saw online that Funny Playing is working on Game Boy Advance support. I don't know how they're trying to pull this off. I think they probably are gonna just release a FPGBA in the future, which would be quite cool in my opinion. And the other downside is flashcards. The flashcards simply do not work. When I now switch over to this, I will get the same error, loading microSD initial error. I tried many different things, it never works, but as soon as I put it in my normal Game Boy Color, it works flawlessly. Of course, this isn't exactly a big downside in comparison to the Analogue Pocket, because the Easy Flash Junior also doesn't work on the Analogue Pocket. But still, the Analogue Pocket has some ways to play ROMs, opposed to the FPGBA. But of course, there are far more pros to this device. First of all, as I already mentioned, the price. It doesn't cost more than one of these modded. Another thing is, it's quite modern, because it supports USB-C charging, which is amazing. It was not too long ago that some of these third-party articles always came with micro USB-C. Some still do. And I'm glad Funny Playing paid the extra 5 cents it takes to install USB-C. Another big pro is the assembly. It is easy. It's really easy. You have to plug in 2 things, screw it together, and done. I would almost say it's easier than do a screen swap on a Game Boy Color. That's how easy it was. And now to the software. The FPGBC has a little menu that you can access by pressing the volume rocker. This menu contains brightness, volume, the display mode, which contains integer scaled ×4, ×4 with a pixel grid, and full screen. You also have the option to switch between the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Core. You also have the options to switch the palettes. That will only be relevant in the Game Boy Core though. Next up, you have the frame mix. This prevents the flickering, which was used as a hacky way to implement transparency and makes it look far better than a lot of other devices. The GB clear fix, I have no idea what that does to be honest, and I couldn't find really anything. Next up, you have the speed. You can adjust the clock of the CPU itself to make the games run faster or slower, which I think is quite handy, especially in games like Pokemon. And next up, you can save, you have a little battery indicator, or you can reset the console. So let me quickly switch it over to Game Boy mode. And just like the screen for the Game Boy Pocket that is also produced by Funny Playing, you have the different palettes. And they are pretty much the same colors that you have on that screen mod itself as well. And the last thing I'm wondering about the FPGBC is how long does the built-in battery last? I will put up a little time lapse and show you the results. But with all of that said, I recommend getting one of these. I think this is a great little project, especially if you really like the Game Boy and Game Boy Color system and you have a lot of cartridges that you can play with. Added to that, price-wise, they are quite nice, especially if you already want to buy a Game Boy Color or you want to dip your fingers into FPGA gaming. I hope Funny Playing is continuing to support this, and I hope they build some adapters that allows us to play Game Boy Advance games and maybe add some shoulder buttons to the adapter here on the side. Who knows? It might be possible.